Welcome to What's What with Heather Harris, the podcast for the fiercely hopeful. Here, we explore the lesser-known innovations, overlooked ideas, and hidden forces quietly shaping our human experience. I'm your host, Heather Harris. Let's find out what's what. Today, we're traveling through time with Dr. Brandy Schillace, historian, novelist, podcaster, and television show host. She is a freelance journalist as well as a writer of nonfiction and fiction. Her most recent book, The Intermediaries, tells the forgotten, daring history of trans activists, gender-affirming surgeries, and the fight for LGBTQ rights in the shadow of the Third Reich. This book is a historical examination of boundary crossers and bridge builders, people who dared to ask what it really means to be human, long before we had the language of modern medicine or technology. It serves as an important reminder that in a world racing toward the future, some of our best lessons lie behind us in the strange, bold, and beautiful history of how we've tried to understand ourselves. Under the Weimar Republic, in the pre-Nazi era, though it was by no means a time of equality, there was some progress towards acceptance and visibility of LGBTQ+ communities. We know how that turned out as hatred engulfed the nation with the rise of the Third Reich. Today, though there have been great gains in the establishment of rights and equality, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, has reported that there are 616 anti-LGBTQ+ bills being tracked in U.S. state legislatures this year alone. These are bills targeting transgender rights, protections, healthcare access, and more. Furthermore, in a recent Gallup poll, 1 in 4 Americans reported receiving poor treatment or harassment in the past year because of their sexual orientation. This all begs the question, what can the past teach us about compassion, curiosity, and the courage to hope, even when it feels like we're moving backwards? So let's get into it. You are a prolific writer and an avid historian who has set their sights on the difficult and perhaps much lesser known history of LGBTQ+ rights in the shadow of the Third Reich. What inspired you, Brandy, to focus your attention on this particular period in your most recent book, The Intermediaries?
Well, when I first got the idea to write it, we were in the pandemic and in the first Trump presidency, and I did not realize that when I wrote it, I was going to be accidentally kind of keeping pace with the way things were happening in real time. So that, I think in retrospect, people will think that's why I wrote the book. But in fact, that happened kind of around the edges of the book. I originally wrote it because I had come across the story of Magnus Hirschfeld while researching something else. And I thought, I am a historian of medicine and science. I am an advocate for rights for minorities. How is it that I have never heard of Magnus Hirschfeld? You can understand how maybe the average person might, but how come I hadn't? And actually, I believe that he's much better known subsequently than he was when I first picked up the story. And so I began researching it. And what I realized is, we hear a lot of people saying things like, oh, transgender is a fad. It's new. They've learned it from TikTok or something like that. And here, 100 years ago, you had people who were, in some ways, more progressive even than we are already now, saying, no, this makes sense, using science to talk about the science of hormones, which were just recently discovered and understood. They got their name in 1905, but they've been understood prior to that as secretions. And, you have people going, wait a minute, if you have glands all over your body that are producing hormones that are affecting change in your body, then it's not a choice. So it was basically this understanding that perhaps this is something that isn't a choice. Perhaps this is something that you can be born as. And in the time period, the idea that something could be natural and nature couldn't be sinful, but they thought if a human choice could be sinful. So it was a way of saying, look, we need to stop we need to stop maligning people who are LGBTQ, who are homosexual, etc. Because if this is a natural phenomenon, then we're out of line punishing something that is merely natural variation. And so that's kind of where Magnus Hirschfeld came from. And I was thought, how amazing that we had this understanding of this all the way back then, such that a hundred, well, actually a little bit more than 100 years ago now, in the early 1920s was when the first transgender surgeries, as we think of them, were happening. And I thought, what a story! How is this? How is this been buried? How come we don't know that this history exists? And that was really kind of what led me to it, because I do a lot of history on the fringes and edges, you might say.
Right. Well, I have to agree. I mean, just myself encountering this story that you have told, how is it that not all of us are aware of the origins of the science behind sex and transgender that was rooted here in the Weimar Republic
Hmm.
just prior to the Third Reich, which is a
Right.
very interesting period in history in and of itself.
It is.
So, the term intermediaries, which is the title of your book, is very interesting and it's very evocative. Can you explain this term in a historical context?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say that terminology changes, right? It shifts in within a lifetime. I mean, goodness, think of the way words have changed just, in the last 10 years, much less an entire life or 100 years ago. So I spent a lot of time in the book, and the book has a glossary at the back. I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to slow down and say, okay, these are the words they were using. This is the words we use now. How did we get, what are the permutations of that? Because words make the world. So, as you create words and texts and terminology, you necessarily change the way we think about things. And so it's really important to try and get those right. Well, the same was true for Hirschfeld. When he first began writing, the word homosexual had not yet been coined. That wasn't what people were called. And in fact, the words homosexual and heterosexual were coined by in a letter between a gay man and his friend, and he was using the terms very differently than the way we think about them. He actually used the word heterosexual to mean um, almost what we would think of as sex addiction.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so it's like not the same way
Very
that we think
different.
that we use it, right? But they had different terms. Some of them were decent terms, and some of them were not so nice, right? They had their share of, aspersions that were cast as well. One thing that they used was Uranian, and this comes from they're basically taking from mythology and also from sort of planetary kind of terminology to talk about this. And they didn't necessarily know what to call it either. It becomes homosexual. It becomes and gay is in usage off and on. I forget exactly the year that it enters the lexicon, but for transgender, we really that word is very new in my
Yes.
lifetime new.
Yeah.
Instead, there was a term transvestite, which we've heard that one too, probably. And what Hirschfeld noticed was that there were gay people, and he was arguing for their rights to exist and to not be criminalized for their behavior. Um, and he noticed that as he was researching this, there were gay men and there were gay women, and then there was a subset of people who sometimes their sexuality didn't necessarily align exactly, but he noticed men first who liked to wear the clothes of the opposite gender. And then he also found uh, people who he would consider to be women who liked to wear clothes of men. And and he's like, okay, so what's happening here? So transvestite was the word originally, but then it didn't take long for him to go. This isn't quite right though, because it's not really
Not the
about
whole
clothes.
story.
Yeah. It wasn't about the costume. It was something intrinsic. Some of them really felt like they were a different gender than the gender they had been assigned. And over time, he tries out a number of different, ways of talking about this. And the funny thing about Hirschfeld is as he learns something new, he's like, okay, that last book I wrote, that wasn't quite right. So he writes another book. So there's a lot of books. Every time he sort of discovers something new, he's like, okay, we'll write a book about it. He suggests that there's something like 40 million combinations of gender and sexuality.
Wow.
Like just right, that's a lot of combinations.
That's a lot. Yeah, to get your head
He
around.
figures yeah, he figures out some kind of I'm not sure that that's quite accurate, but it's fun to imagine that he went, look, there's so many, ways that this could intersect. So he is also somebody who understood evolution and Darwin and things like that. And he thought, okay, what we're seeing are intermediate forms. So in his mind, he developed this concept of a spectrum, right? You've got full male on one side and or full man and full woman on the other side. And
Right.
he says these are illusions. He's like, there's no such thing. Nobody's at the end of the spectrum, but we're all in the middle of it. And that the people who were sort of halfway somewhere, that they were intermediate. And
Intermediaries.
yes, and the great thing about this word is it had multiple meanings back then too, in the sense that you could be an intermediary for someone else. So he's calling gay, he sort of uses intermediary as the big umbrella, and then underneath that are, lesbian, gay, etc., kind of falls underneath it.
Yeah.
So he calls them all intermediaries, but it particularly is useful for people who are transgender in this time period, because it's saying, it's a natural evolutionary form that is kind of between, and there was nothing wrong with that, on this spectrum. But it also meant Hirschfeld himself was an intermediary for these people. So yeah, so it has this lovely kind of, it has a science quality to it. It has, and it doesn't, the word still, even today, doesn't really carry any negative baggage, unlike so many other terms. So that was one reason why I really liked it and thought I
Yeah.
liked it so much. I decided to
Yeah.
make it
It's
the
so
title of the book.
positive. So Magnus Hirschfeld, I mean, a pioneer, really.
Mm.
And he has been called, I think I saw this in your book, the Einstein of sex.
Yes, there's actually a book out with that title,
Oh,
written
is there?
by by a colleague of mine. So, who is strictly a biography of Magnus Hirschfeld. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you would, or can you even categorize him? I mean, he was a scientist, as you say,
Hmm.
studying endocrinology and all aspects of the biological conditions of human gender and sex. He was a visionary. So he was looking beyond what we already know. And he was an advocate for
He
LGBTQ
was.
plus people and all of the intermediaries under the
Right.
human umbrella. So can you just expand a little bit for me his work and the Institute of Sexual Science that he established?
So, Magnus Hirschfeld, he was quite a really interesting character, and I talk a lot about him in the book, though the book isn't specifically a biography. He's sort of just one of the very main characters in it. And he's by no means a perfect person either. What makes him unique, in my opinion, is his ability to learn. When
Mm,
he first starts off, he isn't intending to march out there and be an advocate for all intermediary people. But he was a doctor, and one of his patients commits suicide on the eve of his wedding night. And he had written a letter which arrives after his death to Magnus Hirschfeld. And Hirschfeld gets it probably basically right after, like maybe even the same day that he hears about the fact that the gentleman has taken his life. And in it, he tells him, look, I can't marry this woman. This is someone he grew up with. His parents wanted him to marry, but he didn't want to trap her in a loveless marriage. He didn't want to hide anymore, but he also felt like he was a disappointment and, would bring shame on the family, and that the only way in his mind to solve this was to end his life. And he asks Hirschfeld in the letter, can't you do something about this? Can't you make it better for us? And Hirschfeld himself was a gay man. He was closeted most of his life. I don't know if the patient knew that he
right.
was or not. It's never really stated. But what Hirschfeld comes at, he writes a pamphlet called Sappho and Socrates, addressing this after this has happened, where he basically says this man did not commit suicide. He was murdered by a society that didn't accept him.
Hmm.
And the word for suicide is basically means self-murder, kind of, and it almost carried with it, well, I think suicide still has quite a stigma, but it almost carried with it like a blame of the victim. And he was basically saying, no, he was a victim of the society that doesn't understand them, just like many people had committed suicide for being blackmailed because they didn't want their sexuality to come out. And so, he becomes really involved in this. And it's interesting how, and I talk about this in the book, it's even then, it starts off quite small. He gathers a group of like-minded friends and associates who said, okay, we need a scientific humanitarian committee that understands that science will lead us to justice, a more just,
Mm-hmm.
treatment of other human beings. So that's how it begins. And then it continues to grow. And some of this has to do with the people he associates himself with. Originally, he kind of doesn't see women in this whole picture. He's looking at
Yes,
gay men,
yeah,
and
I noticed
and
that.
then
Yeah,
right, and then Helene Stoker comes along. She's a feminist, and they basically become allies. But she's like, "Hi, you're missing a whole group of people here."
yeah,
And then yeah, so then he's like, "Oh, so it's not like he wasn't just fully into it. He kind of grew and learned and changed. And then he made some mistakes. He actually he's used by factions to bring down a gay man who is part of the Eulenberg Roundtable. It's a very complicated situation, but essentially he's kind of used for his beliefs, and he realizes he's made things worse in some ways, and there's kind of a big anti-gay backlash that happens. And so he learns, and that's what I find so fascinating about him. He uses science to try and convince people that being gay, being homosexual or transgender, and intermediate, not he even had an understanding of non-binary. He did,
mm,
and said, okay, this is okay, and we should
mm-hmm,
be okay with this.
mm-hmm.
But there's no easy way to do that in this time period. The fact that he's actually so successful that it almost backfires on him in some ways.
Yeah,
But
he's
yeah.
utilized to tell a
Hmm.
different narrative, right?
Right. But well, because people they're looking for ways to undermine they've got political agendas, and
Mm-hmm.
they're willing to use homosexuality as a means of getting, oh, he's a homosexual, so therefore he's bad at politics or etc. So just like today, it becomes a way of people attacking others. And Hirschfeld's really, really cut up by this. So this is all before he starts the Institute, is him kind of grappling with what happens when you start to raise this issue, but you haven't fully convinced people that it's okay. So suddenly everyone's aware of it, but also not necessarily understanding that it's okay.
Yeah.
And it created a real backlash. And it wasn't his fault either. A lot of this was various political machinations that were happening in the background leading up to World War One. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not until after World War One, which was catastrophic for Germany. And Germany had a very uber masculinist rhetoric that was going on, and people were even saying things like, "Our boys are too feminine. We need a good war, right,
Oh my
to
God,
make
can
them
you
more
imagine?
masculine." Right, I know. And then what ultimately occurs is that an entire generation of young men are basically wiped out.
Yeah.
German men are wiped out in World War One. But all through this, Hirschfeld is learning, and he's making friends, and he's making alliances, and he's learning more about science, and he's meeting other scientists, and he's, you know, um, all sorts of other sexologists who are studying the science of sex. And by the time the Weimar Republic starts up, he has purchased this big building,
Mm-hmm.
and he has named it the Institute for Sexual Science or the Institute for Sexology. And he plans to make it sort of a base of operations for LGBTQ rights, but it also becomes a counseling center, sort of the first place that transgender surgery sort of begin not
Hmm.
necessarily
It
at
was
the
a
institute,
hub,
but it was a hub. Yeah,
hub for the
absolutely.
community. Yeah.
They were doing endocrine therapy. They were, I mean, something we think of as being, they didn't have it, hadn't isolated estrogen and testosterone yet, but they were still using concoctions and trying to,
Figure it
experiment
all
with
out. Yeah.
various, yeah. So these things were happening. They were doing depilation, for
Oh, right.
transgender
Okay.
women. Right. They were doing things to like remove hair from the face. All sorts of things that we just, at counseling to get them to understand, to deal with trauma and to deal with, who they were as people. He even prescribed, he was very keen that you understood yourself as a community, because he realized that so many suicides were actually born of people thinking they were alone.
Yes.
And in the book, The Einstein of Sex, written by my friend Dan, he actually has a copy of one of the prescription cards where he has prescribed someone to go to a drag bar. Like
Oh,
you need
you're
to go find
kidding.
your
I love
people
that. Oh, I
and
love that.
and like, you know,
Yeah,
meet
people
people,
still
go
need
meet
those
people.
prescriptions today.
Yeah.
It's good for anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely. And so, so this was the way he operated. But he was also quite he understood that propaganda was being used against them, and he wanted to build his own propaganda machine. Like, okay, we're going to drop pro LGBTQ flyers. I mean, he was really
Hmm.
out there, and he was not above twisting the law when he could to kind of make allowances for people. He managed to get these licenses that would allow you to essentially cross-dress. So that you couldn't be arrested for it. And you had like a medical signature on it, and you could do that. Later, for people who wanted to change their gender and then change their name, that was not legal unless you were what we would call intersex,
Okay.
what they then called hermaphrodite or hermaphrodism.
Right.
And what he did is he, published another book claiming that there was such a thing as psychological or spiritual hermaphrodism, and then giving people the diagnosis so that they could go and get their names changed once that. So he was he was sneaky too. He understood how to kind of like, anything at all costs. He was trying to help his patients. Sometimes that worked really well. Sometimes it didn't work as well. But along the way, what his story kind of shows is how many other people were willing to back him. And so my book, unlike the Einstein of Sex, my book kind of hopscotches from his life into the other people, Levi Lenz, the surgeon, and many, many of the patients, which I think is a story that often gets left out of these histories.
Absolutely. Like Dora Richter. There's so
Hmm.
many stories
Gerd
of
Katter,
these.
yeah.
Yeah. And they're pioneers in and of themselves, whether they knew it or not, in their suffering and their trials and their tribulations and their connection with Hirschfeld and some of these other scientists. Is there one that stands out to you, a story of one of these individuals that you would want to highlight?
Mm. So when I first got the idea to write the book, I knew I needed the story of Dora Richter, partly because we have some of her story, and it is very difficult. Earlier you said, why do more people not know about this history? But there's one part of it that everybody knows really well, and that is the book burning. People have seen pictures, they've seen footage, the black and white film. It's even got sound. It's on newsreels, and most people remember that. They can even picture it in their head. Your listeners are picturing it in their heads right now. But what people don't know is that that was the Institute for Sexology's library that they were burning on the Orpenplatz. So thousands and thousands of books and pamphlets and papers. And so unfortunately, this very well documented stories of these patients' lives, much of that is gone.
Mm,
What remains, I've had to kind of pull from fringes and edges, and sometimes I described this to someone else not too long ago. It's almost as though looking at the space it ought to have occupied to figure out its shape.
yeah.
But in the case of Dora Richter, when she came in for her intake interview, which everyone did when they came to the Institute, there was a young doctor who wanted to get a PhD. And so when he writes his PhD later, he decides to include almost verbatim the entire intake interview with Dora Richter,
Interesting.
probably for word count. But because it's there, it doesn't get published in a journal, but it's published as it's typed up as a dissertation, and it is saved in the university archive, and that's where it remained.
Okay.
So I found out that it existed, and it was in this brittle onion skin paper on really light blue ink. It was very, very difficult to read, and I had to go to Berlin. Like, I couldn't get it any other way. They wouldn't send it to me. I had to physically go there. I tell a story. I won't do it here because it's quite lengthy, but I do tell a story about the amount of trouble it was for me to actually get this out of
Yeah.
Berlin. Later, they digitized it and put it online, and I think I'm why. I think they were like, we don't want her to come back. But
I
but
love it.
it was all in German, and it's of course it's medical. and it's period. And so I went in search of somebody who could translate very specifically the medical jargon that was being used because I wanted to make sure we got this exact so that
Hmm.
I could use the words of Dora Richter as I told her story.
Hmm.
And we have a pretty good idea of her background. She was quite young. She was about 3 years old, probably, when she first is made to understand that she's supposed to wear trousers and not dresses. And she's incensed by this. She does not understand why. She cannot wear, she was christened Rudolph. She later gives herself the name Dora. And she just doesn't understand. She thinks of herself as a girl as early as the age of 3. By 13, she has attempted to alter her own appearance in a way that could have been quite catastrophic. She fails to do this. She tries to take off her own phallus. She fails to do this. And she tries to commit suicide. She's 13 years old. And I say this because she grew up in Siphon, this town, tiny, tiny town on the side of a mountain in what was then Bohemia and now the Czech Republic. And there is no way, like she didn't know any gay people. She was not learning how to be trans from TikTok, right? Like this is just proof that here's somebody who was born in this very rural setting who just had this understanding of herself the whole time, her whole life. So she lives a sort of dual life, living as both genders at different points, living as a woman as often as she can, and all up until the point. And many bad things happen to her, good things. She's sort of this unsinkable kind of spirit that I think she's just so lovely. She's so
Yeah.
loving and caring. Terrible things happen to her, and she still just maintains this kind of really upbeat personality. Anyway, we follow her all the way up until the point at which she enters the institute, and then I take up the story of the surgeon, who then talks about her journey there. And
Yeah.
then ultimately, because of work that a transgender researcher who named Clara Hartman was doing, she and I were both working and we had been texting, emailing back and forth. She discovers what happened to Dora subsequently, that she went on and and here we had thought for a long time that she had perished when the Nazis raided the institute. In fact, she outlives the Nazis. She lives into her 60s as,
I was
it's
thrilled to
wonderful.
learn
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And she also had gender affirming surgery, and she was ultimately
She
able
changed
to
her
change
name
her
and her gender.
name and her gender.
And is remembered just as a woman.
Yeah.
Like she's not remembered as a transgender icon. She's just remembered as some woman. She
Yes.
really fully lived as a woman for the rest of her life.
Yeah, I was so thrilled to learn that that was the outcome because you would not think, and I'm sure it was not the case for very many
Mm.
intermediaries,
Hmm.
transgender people at that time with the rise of the Third Reich.
And the other case, the other patient that I have some, again, limited, but have enough to put in the book, is Gerd Katter, who was a trans man.
Hmm.
And Gerd Katter lived, as a matter of fact, the gentleman, Ralph Doza, who runs the Hirschfeld archive, met Gerd after the wall
Hmm.
came down in Berlin. So lived long enough to be interviewed by Ralph Doza, and so that's where I got some of my information about Gerd Katter. So we have at least two really good examples of people who just went on and lived their lives.
Yeah.
So
Despite like almost against all odds, but
and both
also with the help of people like Magnus Hirschfeld.
absolutely Magnus Hirschfeld and the surgeon Levi Lenz, who wrote an autobiography and so talks quite a bit about the institute and his work there. But that doesn't make everyone, and this is something that's really hard to kind of understand in the context. One of the surgeons who performed surgeries on Dora Richter and later on Lily Elba later ended up working for the Nazis and performing really rather atrocious things, medical experiments and etc. on Jewish men. So you think that, well, look, they're so forward thinking, but not. The story's quite complex, and some of the one of the things that the institute did is it treated many, many, many homosexual patients, and by treating them, that meant everything from sexually transmitted diseases to therapy to etc. And quite a lot of them were Nazis. And so before 1933, you had this strange moment in time where I try to tell people we tend to think that the Nazis were a foregone conclusion, that they were always going to happen, and they weren't. And this book really charts just how closely we came to not having Nazis, but
Yes.
then, just the perfect kind of storm of things. And divisions between and among those who were trying to fight against the Nazis ultimately gave, because the Nazis never had a majority, but they just had a
Yeah.
little bit more than everyone else. And,
Yeah. And you're right to point that out. It's the divisions among the people who are actually fighting against the Nazis that
mhm,
allowed this
right.
horrendous episode in our history. So, on that note, the Nazi destruction of the Institute in 1933 portended much worse to come, as we
Mm.
know. What comparisons would you make or can you make with the events in today's society, both in the West and beyond?
Well, I mean, when I was working on the book, I had moments where I would work on the book all day and then I would watch the news and be like, did I just manifest that? Like, am I making this happen? Because I would be like, I just wrote about this. It was very much a situation where a lot of this starts with misogyny. So in the 19th century, I hate to keep going backwards in history, but I'm a historian, so I do that.
Mhm.
Um, in the 19th century, you had a lot of things changing. You had the Industrial Revolution, different roles for men and women, different roles for the family. Women were getting out into the workforce. Women wanted the vote. Women were changing, they wanted more. They wanted like control of their reproductive destinies. Shock. So you had a backlash to that. So as women gained ground, this backlash kind of swings in with this masculinist rhetoric. And the interesting thing about hatred is that it works like a snowball rolling downhill. Because this book was me basically asking, um, how do we first begin to hate? You don't just get Nazis, right? Like they don't just arrive.
Yes. Yeah.
Something leads
There's
to
a
this,
building. Yeah.
right? And so I realized that this misogynistic rhetoric was willing to pick up other things as it rolled downhill, right?
Right.
So it goes after gay men, and then it goes after transgender people, and then it goes after Jewish men. And each time it uses femininity as like the cudgel, right? So it says,
Right.
oh, gay men
The
are
defining
feminizing.
feature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gay men are feminizing our youth. We can't have that. Transgender people are turning our boys into girls. We can't have that. I mean, you hear this today.
Yeah.
Jewish men. They claimed Jewish men were too feminine, and and that Jewish men were turning boys gay while also seducing women. Like they decided to just blame everybody for everything.
Yeah.
But as a result, Hitler calls Hirschfeld, a gay Jewish man running a transgender clinic, the most dangerous Jew in Germany and puts a hit out on his life. And Hirschfeld ends up in the hospital, almost gets killed,
Mhm.
gets attacked a couple of times, narrowly misses, there was a bomb threat, like all kinds of things are
Yeah.
happening to him. And I thought, wow, why? So the very first thing the Nazis burn are the transgender clinic document or the institute documents. The very person they keep trying to kill off is Magnus Hirschfeld. What was so threatening about
Yeah.
transgender people? What was so threatening
Yeah.
about women? What was the threat? And what the book basically says, and this is where I'm kind of leading us to today.
Mhm.
Hirschfeld understood that the way to defeat evil was to get everyone else together. And he aligned himself with women and with feminists and with social democrats and with, he went to Russia and visited, like, so with communists, like he was like, okay, we're going to fight. We're all going to get in this together and we're going to fight. And they were undermined by the other side using propaganda, by controlling the media, to argue to insert kind of like, well, you don't want to trust them and they don't want to trust you, and basically inserting these divisions. And the divisions were there, they weren't imaginary. There
Yeah.
was a
They were taking
masculinist,
advantage of existing.
right,
Yeah.
right, there was a
Fear.
masculinist group of gay men who didn't like Hirschfeld because they thought he was feminizing gay, and they were like, no, gay men are manly men. This is, it's a, we have that, we still have it, it's still there.
Yeah.
So the other side recognized, oh, there's these divisions. We can use that, because the last thing they wanted was for people to organize. And you know how they organized? They organized around really joyous things. They had balls and galas. They were happy in their lives, and they were comfortable, and they were expanding definitions of what it meant to be a person. And our enemies, alas, seem to me to be incapable of joy. And I
Yeah.
think they mistrust joy in many ways, and they certainly mistrust those of us who express it and who can come together as a community, not to use one another, but simply
Yes.
to uphold one another. So that was very, they realized that that would break them. The Nazis knew that they could not beat them in a fair fight. So that was why they were quite scared of them. And so when I look around today and I see once again the control of the media
Hmm.
by people who are manipulating words and stories to try and sow divisions, so that,
Hmm.
for instance, the very impoverished in the United States who ought to be fighting tooth and nail against the right that want to take their health care and their food stamps and all these other kinds of things, nonetheless have sided with the very people trying to harm them. And
Yeah.
why? Because those people have said, ooh, your real enemy are immigrants. Your
Yeah.
real enemy are people with a different skin color than you or a different religion than you. And
Yeah.
so we're seeing that happen again. And once more, transgender people are being kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? They're the ones being thwarted. Well, why would that be? And I thought, what is it about transgender? Well, it makes sense though, doesn't it? Because it's a blurring of the boundaries and a recognition of personhood over rules.
Ah,
And they're not going to like that.
they're not going to like that. Yeah, it has been a question on my mind. Why target this community that is so small? Like, really, it's not a very large, vocal, well-supported community as much as it should be.
Right. And we're not armed unless you like count our kinky boots, I suppose. But
Yes, and the intelligence. It is quite
well,
an
yes, that's
intelligent
true.
community. Yeah,
I'm in the
and Kinky
community
Boots,
and I do have
they
my
go a
fair
long
share.
way, Brandy.
I have my fair share of very high heels um, that I feel like technically could be weapons. But
They could be
yeah.
weapons, but it's always boggled my mind. Why this community? Why is this,
Hmm.
under assault?
And Hirschfeld, so I am someone who considers themselves to be gender fluid or non-binary, or basically because I think the binary boxes are small and stupid.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and that fluidity, that itself is something that was deeply threatening. They did not want there to be a spectrum. They wanted people to be in their boxes, to
Yes,
stay in their
in your
lane.
box, and
And
no X on the passport is not allowed, and
right.
just right?
Well, and I think the other important point here is again, it's you saying, there's a me in here that is kind of outside of, and I should mention, I'm also autistic, and there's a big overlap between autism and LGBTQ. And the reason is autistic people, we already feel like everything's performance, so gender feels rather performed as well.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that doesn't make it not real. It just means like there's a spectrum, right? We can all kind of inhabit this differently, but it means understanding that you have a self and that you have value outside of the little tick boxes that society wants you to kind of fit in. And it's a realm of creative thinking and creative being in the world that is deeply threatening to those who want to rule in an authoritarian way.
Exactly. You have written that you hope that this book will not be regarded solely as a tragedy, but as a testament to the stories of those chronicled here. And you did really weave hope into these tales of oppression and struggle. Was that a concerted effort, or was it a fairly easy thing to do when as you move through the research?
It was a concerted effort, not to say that the hope is there, but for one thing, psychologically, humans tend to focus on the negative more than the positive, such that it takes like three positive things to undo a negative thing in our minds.
Yeah.
So no, it's never easy to lead with the hope. The hope is there, but it is hard. And one of the things that I repeatedly say in all of my talks and in what I wrote and everything is that we have to guard against feeling like you can't fight oppression unless you yourself are sort of miserable the whole time. And it simply isn't true. You need to fill yourself with joy and to have happiness and to watch Instagram reels of cats and on skateboards or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I
um,
live for those videos.
you
Yeah.
need that, and that's not ignoring the crisis. It's not. Yeah, and really, when people yuck yums, I get real offended because I'm like, no. You need that, but not only do you need it, you deserve it.
Yeah.
You're owed it. You owe it to the world to have joy because joy is itself a weapon. We know that they're afraid of us. We know that they're afraid of the joy that we have, that we carry, and the hope, and that being your authentic self is an act of radical resistance. And you cannot march on an empty life. You just can't. It'd be like trying to go to battle without having any food in your system. Like you have to feed yourself with joy and hope and all of the things that make life worth living in the first place.
Yeah.
And, otherwise, what are you fighting for? And so that is something I tried to make sure I was constantly coming back to in this book because they had masked balls like pretty much all the way up until 1933. Like
Right.
anytime they could get a chance to dress up and do their stuff, it was a good time. They had big dinners together. There was a lower floor in the institute where the patients, the doctors, the visitors, the guests, Magnus, they all ate together like every day. And it was a requirement. Like if you, there were Christopher Isherwood has renting rooms, and they're like, "Well, you have to come down to lunch." And he's like, "What?" He's like, "Oh yeah, we all this is what we do. So
Everybody,
you have to come
everybody
down
does
here."
it. Yeah.
And he's sitting there, and there's like, doctor here, and a dignitary here, and a transgender woman here, and and he's just kind of
Yeah.
like, I don't know what to do with this strange assortment of people, and that was it. Enjoy, love, have big Christmas parties. Like they had, I mean, Hirschfeld was Jewish. He held these huge Christmas parties because the point was the party,
Yeah. The point was the joy. The point was just having a good time with each other in community. I love that message. I love that
hmm
message of joy. And I love that message of being joyful as an act of resistance.
absolutely. And I think that people are really, I would say this to your listeners, I would say this particularly to young listeners, to closeted listeners, to those who, for whom either for safety reasons or other reasons can't be out in public, you being you in the moments that you can, that still is part of the battle. Like you're doing enough just by being yourself. And I think we beat ourselves up. It's like, oh, I didn't go to a march or I didn't. Well, there's lots of other things you can do, including being kind to those around you and supporting them while they do other things. We don't all have the same set of skills. I write, so that's how I do it. You
Yeah.
know, Other people march, some people organize, some people simply just go about their lives being like Dora Richter, her
Yes.
true, authentic, amazing, unsinkable self. And I think that is something that people don't realize how valuable they are to the fight, even when you're not physically doing something that you think counts. It matters, you matter.
Yeah. I love that message. In line with this, in the beginning of the book, you introduce Karl Heinrich Ulrichs,
hmm
one of the first, if not the first, homosexual who argued for, in your words, the naturalness of
hmm
homosexuality. One of the most courageous acts of the time, I would say. And you quote him as saying, hatred alone has enjoyed freedom of speech. And this struck me.
hmm hmm
And that seems, again, back to it
Very
seems like
now.
a very appropriate quote for the climate of today. And not to
hmm
dwell on it, but I think this is why this conversation and why your book is so critically important at this time. Would you agree?
I would, and I would say too that it's very in light of recent political developments too, there's a weird way in which the left often will self-police, but not police the right, and the right will police the left too.
Yes.
um, and not police the right. And there's a sense in which we're so fearful of offending that we end up giving hatred the fullest measure of free speech
Yes.
and having far less ourselves. And I remember when the book came out, I did struggle to get it. I mean, it's published by W. Norton and Company. It's been well distributed, but I struggled to get it carried in certain bookstores. And I would go, and I remember one day I walked into a bookstore, and on the front, right in the front window, they had a book on like Hitler's religion or something, but like my book was downstairs in the basement. And I thought it just feels as though we're almost always apologizing for having these progressive views about how people should have rights, and not asking for apologies,
Yeah.
when they're offended, or when they're tread upon, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So it does feel that way, increasingly, to the point that you have the cancel culture has turned into a who can we blame for something and then use that to stigmatize them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that happened in Hirschfeld's time too. They brought people down by claiming they were gay or claiming this or claiming that. I actually it was interviewed at one point, I think might have been for the Washington Post, about Marjorie Taylor Greene's habit of calling anyone she doesn't like a pedophile, which was something that they did in pre-Nazi Germany as well. As in the lead up to 1933, they basically claimed that homosexuals were pedophiles. They claimed that Hirschfeld, all of these people, they basically claim all of them are groomers, and that's why they should be attacked and lose their positions and etc. And so, that hasn't changed.
Yeah, we're seeing it still.
And there's never been any substantiation that somehow having a different sexual, preference puts you in that camp, but they've always been treated that way, like all the way back.
Well, it's trying to again malign a
Malign,
community,
yeah.
malign
Mhm.
people, and just associate it with something that's very,
And
abhorrent.
people have such a knee-jerk reaction that it often goes uninvestigated as well. So it's one of those claims that, if you cast it at somebody, you feel like you've kind of got them. Drag queens who read stories to small children, who have not been called up on any charges of anything like that, while numerous people in religious authorities,
Exactly. I
you
know.
know,
Right?
yeah, like I have never been injured by a drag queen
Never. No.
ever,
Never, never, and never would I ever expect to. Yeah, what is the fear? What does hold us back from
Mhm.
demanding apologies and calling it out and policing?
It wouldn't be a problem if both sides were practicing with the same level of integrity. If both sides were like, "Oh, I don't want to offend, but neither do you," and so therefore we are, holding each other accountable.
Right.
Instead, we've become so imbalanced. And I will say, if you look at maps, sorry, this is kind of off topic, but if you look at maps of the right and left in the United States, going all the way back to, let's say, 1850, and you'll notice that in terms of the things that they voted on, there was a much greater middle, a much bigger bell curve,
Yeah.
where red and blue, it was purple in the middle, like
Yes.
mainly.
Yes.
And as time has gone on, this has really, really begun to shift
Mm.
so that there's no one in the middle and everyone's kind of,
The
pulled
great
pulled to one
divide.
side. Yeah, and that is an indication partly, and people say, oh, well, okay, so both sides are doing it, but that isn't true. It's more that we find ourselves chasing the center as things go further right. And so left now leans further towards the center than they did originally. And so
Yeah.
we're out of balance. We're out of balance politically. And this happens usually in times of great upheaval. You have to look at the time period leading up to the First and Second World War. You just had, we had the flu pandemic of 1918,
Right.
followed by the big economic crashes and instability across various nations, and a change in the way gender roles were working. And here we are again, following a pandemic in a time of great economic instability when gender
Yeah.
roles are being redefined.
Hmm.
And you see that again, people get quite frightened and well, and they pull their tentacles in. I think you feel less generous suddenly. People are sort of like trying to, y- you know, it- there's a sense in which conservative can mean a lot of things. Like you're trying to conserve, right? And they
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
pull back,
Yeah.
rather than liberality. They don't want to give because there
Hmm.
seems to be, fewer things available, and that makes people quite frightened and I think rigid. But it wouldn't be as big of a problem if you didn't have actors taking advantage of the situation, using the media to
Hmm.
drive propaganda. So you'd have that instability anyway. But what happened then and what's happening now is you have people going, I see this instability as a way for getting power or money or something else for myself. And
Yeah.
therefore, I am going to use this time of instability to support my goals. And that really is where the tipping point happens.
Yeah. So, by recounting this history, Brandy, do you feel that these pioneers that we've talked about, Dora and others, and their courage can help us forge forward and onward in a positive direction when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights and gender affirming care specifically?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that we can draw from them, which hasn't changed because of technology or science or et cetera, is the sense that community matters, that that you need alliances and
Yeah.
support and allies and safe spaces, which is huge. The Institute being one such safe space. But the other thing, and I credit Hirschfeld, he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways, but in most specifically, his sense that how you felt about your gender in the moment that you were feeling something about it mattered more than other kinds of external factors. So for instance, there was a case where one of his patients had lived her whole life as a woman. Then it was discovered she was actually she had a condition, and I'm going to forget which one it was now. It's been a while since I've written it, but essentially she had male chromosomes. We would have recognized she had male chromosomes, but had developed in such a way that she seemed uh, mainly to be female. So not exactly intersex. I forget what the terminology is. Anyway, so this is discovered, and the medical establishment said, okay, so we need to make sure that she gets some boy clothes and goes about and changes her name and goes about living as a man. And Hirschfeld goes, wait a minute, like she's 46. Like let's take a moment here, you know. Let's ask her. And so
Yeah.
he sits down and says, what do you feel yourself to be? And she's like, I have spent 46 years living as a woman. I've been married. She hadn't had children for all the reasons, but like, I have a job that is a woman's job. Like I don't, of course I couldn't possibly think of myself as
Hmm.
suddenly becoming a man just because a scientific test tells me now that I am one. And so he's like, that matters more. That matters more than and I think when when we're trying to do right, as far as transgender people are concerned, sometimes we don't recognize that there's room for flex. We change as people as we age. Again, like I said, I'm a very fluid person. I'm sometimes more masculine and sometimes I'm more feminine, and
Yeah.
I'm being real in all
Hmm.
of those all the time. Not like I'm not pretending. So it's an understanding that you are authentically yourself, if and when you can be your authentic self, that's valid, and it doesn't really matter what the trappings are around that.
Hmm.
So if you're somebody who feels like today I am this person, that's great. That's real. That's you. If 10 years from now you feel in a different way, I mean, nobody expects you to be the same type of person between 20 and 40. So, I think that an understanding that you're going to know yourself better than other people do. This would also help a lot with women's healthcare, that you're going to know yourself better than other people do.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Let's hope there's a lot of medical professionals listening to you say that right now. So we're going to wrap up on this. This is going to be a little pearl of wisdom from you, Brandy. Though it feels like society, as we've discussed, is repeating some of these terrible and dark mistakes that we've seen in history, would you share with us what, if anything, gives you hope now for a brighter, more inclusive future?
I think one of the things that gives me hope is that increasingly to young people, it really doesn't matter that much. For instance, you're transgender, you're straight, you're gay, you're whatever. Those are things about you, but they're not the most important things about you. And I think we'll be in a much better place when this ceases to be a focal point and we just care more about who people are. Like they like
Yes,
Star Wars. I like Star Wars.
exactly.
Cool. And I do feel like I'm seeing that amongst younger generations. Sort of your Gen Zs, your Gen Alpha, this kind of concept that, it just no one cares, and I find it usually comes up when, less so now that I'm not actively teaching, but when I was a professor, when you would be teaching something, they're like, why did anybody care about this? And I'm like, I don't know, honey.
I know. This is the big question. Yeah.
um, so it gives me hope to think that we have moved forward. We have. I know we're feeling and experiencing a pendulum shift, particularly in the US, but also in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
We're experiencing that pendulum shift is real, but we have still moved so far forward in both women's rights and just, rights in general. As an autistic person, I am not loving the whole message of RFK Jr. right now, but
Oh,
in
God.
so many ways, I am more able to live openly as a neurodivergent person than I would have been 10, 15 years ago. So we are moving ahead. It is a sort of two steps forward or one step back kind of situation, but it's worth fighting for, and we are making a difference. I know it feels sometimes like we're not, but we are.
I think so. And I think your book and these conversations really does help push the conversation forward. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. It's nice to be on.
Yeah, so this has been an amazing conversation, a critically important conversation, I think I said as we started off. So where can our listeners find you and find your work, Brandy?
I'm everywhere. So one of the nice things about having a first name that is basically a French alcohol, brandy, and a last name that is Italian by extraction is that there is only one Brandy Schillace.
Yeah.
So if you can spell it, you can find me. And I would say this book is available most places at W. Norton and Company, W. Norton and Company, and has appeared and been distributed in various places, even in translation. For instance, it's being translated into German for
Okay.
publication in Germany. I also write fiction, and my fiction is also out in Canada as well as the United States. And my fiction features an autistic heroine. So that's the Framed Women of Ardmore House and The Dead Come to Stay. So you can find all sorts of things by me. And just in case you would also like to read about the first successful head transplant, I wrote about that too. Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, which is about Cold War transplant science, um, which really happened.
That's crazy. Okay, that's next on my reading list. Okay.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, I've written about the history of science and the history of death and dying and lots of other things. So I hope you guys can find my work and that you will enjoy it.
Definitely. I will include it in the show notes, and I can't wait to read more of your work. Thanks so much, Brandy.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on What's What with Heather Harris. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find their way here, because the more the merrier. The future is something that we influence and imagine together. I'm Heather Harris, and until next time, stay curious and stay fiercely hopeful.